Secession. 4 days after Lincoln was elected, so keep in mind, not when Lincoln becomes the president, just when he's been elected, South Carolina, their legislature is going to call on their state citizens to basically elect delegates to a convention to consider secession. At that point, South Carolina's delegates would actually vote unanimously to leave the Union. The thing is, by February, we're going to see 6 other states holding similar conventions and also deciding to leave the Union. So the representatives of these 7 seceding states are going to meet and form the Confederate States of America. Now, really quick here, I'm going to talk about a couple things in regards to this. First of all, the Confederate States of America are never actually acknowledged and recognized formally as their own nation by any nation in the entire world. So from now on, I'm going to only refer to it as the so-called Confederate States of America. I don't expect you to call it that in like writing and everything like that, but I call it this because it's really important to understand that this never was their own nation. It was a failed attempt at creating their own nation. And so I will call it as the so-called Confederacy because I don't want to establish any legitimacy behind it. So, February 18th, we're going to see Jefferson Davis is going to be sworn in as the so-called president of the so-called Confederacy. Now, the so-called Confederacy did have a really effective propaganda campaign. They're going to use the press to kind of persuade voters to, send these delegates to these state conventions and vote on secession because they're going to basically frame this issue as this was a personal challenge to every Southerner. And they're going to argue that it would be cowardly to remain in the Union. Instead, they're going to maintain that, the so-called Confederacy is really the true heirs of the whole spirit of 1776 and the original, Declaration of Independence. Now, Lincoln and the Republicans, they're going to frame as being, trying to deny Southerners the right of liberty and life and the pursuit of their version of happiness. Now, keep in mind that Lincoln does not take office until March 4th of 1861. Until that point, Buchanan is actually the president of the United States, and his administration is going to have to cope with this whole secession crisis. James Buchanan is really going to fail to work out any kind of solution in Congress as secession fever sweeps across the lower South. Keep in mind, James Buchanan had lost the support of Northern Democrats after the whole Lecompton Constitution incident, and so he had gone on to fill his cabinet with Southerners. But as the South secedes, more and more of representatives in Washington and Buchanan's cabinet leave with the South. Quick reminder, just because I always have somebody get this confused, North, I'm going to use the Union as another phrase. So the North and the Union are the same, and the South and the so-called Confederacy are the same. Quick note, the so-called Confederacy loses the Civil War. I always have somebody that gets that confused. They lose. The South loses. Can make that clear. So anyway, jumping back to Buchanan. So he had lost a lot of support, and so facing this crisis, he's going to propose actually having a constitutional convention and try to amend the Constitution to basically satisfy the South's demands when it comes to slavery. But this would have been seen as basically an outright surrender to the South, and there's no way that anything would have passed in Congress. So Buchanan's administration's quickly going to fall apart. Representatives, senators are leaving Washington as states secede. Buchanan does very little more than condemn secession. Now, part of the reason for this is that he didn't want to limit Lincoln's incoming administration on what their options were to deal with the secessionist crisis. And keep in mind, only really the lower South at this point has seceded, and he didn't want to tip the upper South to also secede as well. We're also going to see some peace proposals being put forward. The thing is, leading up to this point, we've seen conflicts over slavery, and that brought, ingenuity, goodwill amongst people, especially political leaders, to bring compromises. But by this point in time, by the winter of 1860 to 1861, really the two sides had very little trust in each other. And a compromise would really be, it almost was a symbolic surrender rather than, the salvation of the Union. There are going to be a few plans put forward to try to extend the Missouri Compromise and everything, but these don't really get anywhere in Congress. Now, Lincoln is not quite the president yet, but we're getting to the days up to that. And he said nothing publicly about secession, but he does make it known that he didn't favor the compromise that was being proposed. And instead, he's really going to try to count on Unionist sentiment to keep the Upper South from seceding. Lincoln really felt like if the longer the Lower South was isolated, the more likely they would be to return to the Union because of infighting and everything. And so one by one, we do see in this time period up to Lincoln becoming president that the Upper South will basically register their support for the Union. But there is a limit to their unionism. Most of these Upper South delegates are basically going to assume that Congress at some point would reach one of the compromises proposed, such as the Crittenden proposals, which were the extension of the Missouri Compromise all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And so the Upper South delegates really viewed themselves as peacemakers. It was very unlikely they would abide the use of federal force against their southern neighbors, because think about economically and socially, they have a lot more in common with the Lower South that has just seceded than a lot of their northern states that are neighbors. Now, Lincoln himself does see slavery as basically having come to a crisis before the nation could solve it, which is also kind of crazy considering how many conflicts we've had over slavery leading up to this point. In public, he's going to say that he would never interfere with slavery, though, in the slave states, but it is very clear, well, it's not clear to a lot of people at that time, but it's clear to us now that Lincoln really did have a moral revulsion towards the institution of slavery. And so he just wants more time. However, Lincoln is not going to get more time. In Lincoln's inaugural address, Lincoln denounced secession and vowed to uphold federal law, but tempers his firmness with a conciliatory conclusion, basically assuring the South that, we are friends, not enemies. However, Southerners Southerners wanted concessions. They didn't just want conciliation and pretty speeches. And Lincoln says nothing about slavery in the territories. He said nothing about the amendments proposed in Congress and peace proposals. He said also nothing about the South needing to release federal property that was in the South. More than anything else, like I said before, he hoped for time to get the Lower South states quarreling. He wanted time to build up Union sentiment in the Upper South. He wanted time to convince Northerners that the Union needed preserving, so if war breaks out, they're more likely to want to fight it. Lincoln does not get time. The day after Lincoln's inauguration, Major Robert Anderson, the commander of Fort Sumter in Charleston's harbor, is going to inform Lincoln's administration that he only has 4 to 6 weeks of provisions left. This was basically one of 3 southern forts that were still under federal control, and therefore they were still under the control of the North. Now, Anderson is going to estimate that only a force of at least 20,000 troops could actually provision and defend the fort. Really, Anderson probably was hoping that Lincoln would order him to evacuate the fort. And news of the fort being held by the federal authorities, but basically surrounded by Southern authorities in the so-called Confederacy, is going to change the mood in the North. Because now people view it as the slave power holding Northerners and Northern men hostage. Frustration is going to grow over Lincoln's silence and inaction. Nearly a month later, Lincoln is finally going to move to provision Major Anderson, but he hoped to avoid confrontation. He did not want to send troops, instead would order unarmed ships to proceed to the fort to deliver provisions and leave, and that only if the so-called Confederates fired on them were these individuals actually supposed to force their way into the fort to help, like armed reinforcements and everything. He even went on to notify South Carolina authorities that he only intended to feed the hungry. However, the so-called Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard had basically standing orders to turn back any kind of relief expedition. The thing is, Davis, the so-called president of the so-called Confederacy, basically wanted to take Fort Sumter before provisions arrived and avoid fighting altogether. Neither side really wants to fight, and neither side wants to start the fighting because that looks bad. But the other thing that happens here is Davis, the so-called president of the so-called Confederacy, is going to realize that if there was an outbreak in fighting, that might actually compel the Upper South to join the so-called Confederacy and try to secede the Union. So this means that the Confederacy is put in the position of the so-called Confederacy will fire unprovoked on the American flag in 1861 on April 12th. After more than a day of shelling the fort, General Anderson will eventually surrender. When news reached the North and President Lincoln, he will go on to call the southern states that were still in the Union, that Upper South, to send troops to put down the rebellion. However, what happens is exactly what the Lower South and the so-called Confederacy wanted. Basically, these upper southern states that had still been part of the Union are going to refuse to make war on South Carolina and Virginia. And so at that point, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas will also secede, and the so-called Confederacy is going to expand to 11 states. I want you to be able to see on the right map there, that gives you exactly, so the slave states are the gray states, but then you see that pink outline is the states that make up the so-called Confederacy that tried to secede and leave the Union. So keep in mind there's a few slave states there that did not leave the Union. So I ask you this. Why is this important? Why do we need to remember it? Now, what is it? That is up to your interpretation within this video. You can talk about Fort Sumter itself. You can talk about the secessionist movement. Anything from this video, pick something out and explain why it is important and why we need to remember it all the way to today.